up where we left off last week. A couple weeks ago, I actually came down with a cold last week, which is why I didn't post any videos. Um, I'm starting to get a little bit better. With my cold that I had. But last a couple weeks ago, we were talking about the American Revolution, and I never finished it, so we're gonna get back into it. Um, but to start off, I just celebrated a year at my job. Got my first raise, which is actually pretty good. Basically, to have that going for me. Um, so that's pretty good. So let's get into it. Um, American Revolution. The Revolutionary War was fought back in the 1700s. At the end of 1777, Howe resigned and was replaced by Sir Henry Clinton on May 24th of 1778 with the French entry into the war. He was ordered to consolidate his forces into New York. Now, on June 18th, the British departed Philadelphia with the reinvigorated Americans in pursuit. The Battle of Monmouth on June 28th was inconclusive but boosted Patriot morale. Um, that midnight, the newly installed Clinton continued his retreat into New York, and a French naval force under Admiral Charles Henry Hector d'Estaing was sent to assist Washington, deciding New York was too formidable a target. In August, they had launched a combined attack on Newport with General John Sullivan commanding the land forces. The resulting Battle of Rhode Island was indecisive but badly damaged by a storm that the French withdrew to avoid risking their ships. Um, and it's so damn hot out, I'm fucking sweating like a motherfucker. I did get my pumpkin coffee today. At Dunkin' Donuts, pumpkin coffee is only for a limited time only, but it's only for like in season for like 3 months, and then it's gone after 3-4 months. But as long as it's there, I'll drink it until they take it away. Then I go back to drinking my caramel. Now further activity was limited to British raids on Chestnut Neck and Little Egg Harbor in October. In July of 1779, the Americans captured British positions at Stony Point and Paulus Hook. Clinton unsuccessfully tried to tempt Washington into a decisive engagement by sending General William Tryon to raid Connecticut. Now, in July, a large American naval operation, the Penobscot expedition, attempted to retake Maine but was defeated. Persistent Iroquois raids in New York and Pennsylvania led to the punitive Sullivan expedition from July to September of 1779. Involving more than 4,000 Patriot soldiers, the Scorched Earth campaign destroyed more than 40 Iroquois villages and 160,000 bushels, 4,000 pounds of maize, leaving the Iroquois destitute and destroying the Iroquois Confederacy as an independent power to the American frontier. However, 5,000 Iroquois fled to Canada, where they're supplied and supported by the British and continued their raids. During the winter of 1779 to 1780, the Continental Army suffered greater hardships than at Valley Forge. Morale was poor, public support fell away, the Continental dollar was virtually worthless, and the army was plagued with supply problems. Desertion was common, and mutinies occurred in the Pennsylvania line and the New Jersey line regiments over the conditions of this. In June of 1780, Clinton sent 6,000 men under Wilhelm von Knyphausen to retake New Jersey, but they were halted by local militia at the Battle of Connecticut Farms. Although the Americans withdrew, Knyphausen felt that he was not strong enough to engage Washington's main force, and he retreated. A second attempt 2 weeks later ended in a British defeat at the Battle of Springfield, effectively ending their ambitions in New Jersey. In July, Washington appointed Benedict Arnold commander of West Point, and his attempt to betray the fort to the British failed due to incompetent planning, and the plot was revealed when his British contact John Andre was captured and executed. Benedict Arnold escaped to New York, switched sides in an action that was justified in the pamphlet. In the pamphlet addressed to the inhabitants of America, the Patriots condemned his betrayal, while he found himself almost as unpopular with the British. Now, the Southern strategy was developed by Lord Germain, based on inputs from London-based loyalists, including Joseph Galloway. They argued that it made no sense to fight the Patriots in the North, where they were strongest, while the New England economy was reliant on trade with Britain. On the other hand, duties on tobacco made the South far more profitable for Britain anyway. And while local support meant securing it required small numbers of regular troops, the victory would leave a truncated United States facing British possession to the south, north, and west. With the Atlantic seaboard controlled by the Royal Navy, Congress would be forced to agree to terms. And however, assumptions about the level of loyalist support proved wildly optimistic. Now, Germain ordered Augustine Prevost, the British commander in East Florida, to advance into Georgia in December 1778. Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, an experienced officer, captured Savannah on December 29th of 1778. He recruited a loyalist militia of nearly 1,100 men, many of whom allegedly joined only after Campbell threatened to confiscate their property. Now, poor motivation and training made them unreliable troops, as demonstrated in their defeat by Patriot militia in the Battle of Kettle Creek on February 14th of 1779. Now, although this was offset by British victory at Briar Creek on March 3rd, in June of 1779, Prevost launched an abortive assault on Charlestown before retreating to Savannah, an operation notorious for widespread looting by, by British troops that enraged both Loyalists and Patriots. In October, a joint French and American operation under D'Estaing and General Benjamin Lincoln failed to recapture Savannah. Prevost was replaced by Lord Cornwallis, who assumed responsibility for the German strategy. He soon realized estimates of Loyalist supports were considerably overstated, and he needed far more regular forces. Now, reinforced by Clinton, Cornwallis' troops captured Charlestown. It's a shirt that says dildo. It's a picture of a deer wrapped in a dill pickle, and it says dildo on the shirt. Yeah, dildo. Yep. Now, reinforced by Clinton, Cornwallis' troops captured Charlestown in May of 1780, inflicting the most serious Patriot defeat of the war. Over 5,000 prisoners were taken, and the Continental Army in the South effectively destroyed. On May 29th, Lieutenant Colonel Bonestray Tarleton's mainly Loyalist force routed a Continental Army force nearly 3 times its size under Colonel Abraham Buford at the Battle of Waxhaws. The battle was very controversial for allegations of a massacre, which were later used as recruiting tool by the Patriots. Now Clinton would return to New York, leaving Cornwallis to oversee the South. Despite their success, the two men left barely on speaking terms with each other. The Southern strategy depended on local supports, but this was undermined by a series of coercive measures. Now, previously, captured Patriots were sent home after swearing not to take up arms against the king, and they were now required to fight their former comrades, while the confiscation of Patriot-owned plantations led formerly neutral grandees to side with them. Now, skirmishes at Williamson's plantation, Cedar Springs, Rocky Mount, and Hanging Rock signaled widespread resistance to the new oaths throughout South Carolina. In July of 1780, Congress appointed Gates commander in the South, and he was defeated at the Battle of Camden on August 16th, leaving Cornwallis free to enter North Carolina. Now, despite battlefield success, the British could not control the countryside, and Patriot attacks continued before moving north. Now, Cornwallis sent Loyalist militia under Major Patrick Ferguson to cover his left flank, leaving their forces too far apart to provide mutual support. Now, in early October, Ferguson was defeated at the Battle of Kings Mountain, dispersing organized Loyalist resistance in the region. Despite this, Cornwallis continued into North Carolina, hoping for Loyalist support, while Washington replaced Gates with General Nathaniel Greene in December of 1780. Now Greene divided his army, leading his main force southeast, pursued by Cornwallis. A detachment was sent southwest under Daniel Morgan, who defeated Tarleton's British Legion at Cowpens on January 17th of 1781. Nearly eliminating it as a fighting force, the Patriots now held the initiative in the South with the exception of a raid on Richmond that was led by Benedict Arnold in January of 1781. Now, Greene led Cornwallis in a series of counter marches around North Carolina. By early March, the British were exhausted and short of supplies, and Greene felt strong enough to fight the Battle of Beaufort Courthouse on March 15th. Now, although victorious, Cornwallis suffered heavy casualties and retreated to Wilmington, North Carolina, seeking supplies and reinforcements. Now, Patriots now controlled most of the Carolinas and Georgia outside the coastal areas. After a minor reversal at the Battle of Holbrook's Hill, they recaptured Fort Watson and Fort Mott on April 15th. Now, on June 6th, Brigadier General Andrew Pickens captured Augusta, leaving the British in Georgia confined to Charleston and Savannah. Now, the assumption Loyalists would do most of the fighting left the British short of troops, and battlefield victories came at the cost of losses that they could not replace. Despite halting Greene's advance at the battle of Eutaw Springs on September 8th, Cornwallis withdrew to Charleston, with the little to show for his campaign. Okay, here. So, okay. So from the beginning of the war, Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, allowed the Americans to import supplies and munitions into New Orleans and ship them to Pittsburgh. This provided an alternative transportation route for the Continental Army, bypassing the British blockade of the Atlantic coast. Now, in February of 1778, an expedition of militia to destroy British military supplies and settlements along the Cayuga River was halted by adverse weather. Now later in the year, a second campaign was undertaken to seize Illinois country from the British. Now, Virginia militia, Canadian settlers, and Indian allies, commanded by Colonel George Rogers Clark, captured Kaskaskia on July 4th and then secured Vincennes. Now, though Vincennes was captured by Quebec Governor Henry Hamilton, the Spanish-aligned fur trader Francis Vigo, an American sympathizer, alerted Clark to the threat posed to his control of the West by Hamilton's position. And in early 1779, the Virginians counterattacked the siege of Fort Vincennes and took Hamilton prisoner. Now, Clark secured western British Quebec as the American Northwest Territory in the Treaty of Paris as the Revolutionary War came to an end. Oh, yeah, sweating like a motherfucker still. Okay. Now, when Spain joined France's war against Britain in the Anglo-French War in 1779, their treaty specifically excluded Spanish military action in North America. Now, later that year, however, Galvez initiated offensive operations against British outposts, but first he cleared British garrisons in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Fort Butte, and Natchez, Mississippi, and captured 5 different forts. Now, in doing so, Galvez opened a navigation on the Mississippi River north to the American settlement in Pittsburgh. On May 25th of 1780, British Colonel Henry Byrd invaded Kentucky as part of a wider operation to clear American resistance from Quebec to the Gulf Coast. Now, their advance on New Orleans was repelled by Spanish Governor Galvez's offense on Mobile. Simultaneous British attacks were repulsed on St. Louis by the Spanish Lieutenant Governor de la Brea, and on the Virginia County Courthouse in Cahokia, Illinois, by Lieutenant Colonel Clark. The British initiative under Byrd from Detroit was ended as the rumored approach of Clark. The scale of violence in the Licking River Valley was extreme even for frontier standards, but it led to English and German settlements who joined Clark's militia when the British and the hired German soldiers withdrew to the Great Lakes. The Americans responded with a major offensive along the Mad River in August, which met with some success in the Battle of Piqua, but they did not end Indian raids. So French soldier Augustin de la Balney led a Canadian militia in an attempt to capture Detroit, but they dispersed when Miami natives led by Little Turtle attacked the encamped settlers on November 5th. The war in the West stalemate was the British garrison sitting in Detroit and the Virginians expanding westward settlements north of the Ohio River in the face of British allied Indian resistance. Now, in 1781, Galvez and Pollock campaigned east along the Gulf Coast to secure West Florida, including British-held Mobile and Pensacola. The Spanish operations impaired the British supply of armaments to British Indian allies, which effectively suspended a military alliance to attack settlers down between the Mississippi River and the Appalachian Mountains. Now, in 1782, large-scale retaliations between settlers and Native Americans in the region included the Nananhutun Massacre and the Crawford Expedition. The 1782 Battle of Blue Licks was one of the last major engagements of the war, and news of the treaty between Great Britain and the United States arrived later that year. By this time, about 7% of Kentucky settlers had been killed in battles against Native Americans, contrasted with 1% of the population killed in the 13 colonies. Lingering resentments led to continued fighting in the West after the war officially would end. Now, Clinton spent most of 1781 based in New York City, but he failed to construct a coherent operational strategy, partly due to his difficult relationship with the Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot. And Charleston, Cornwallis independently developed an aggressive plan for a campaign in Virginia, which he hoped would isolate Greene's army in the Carolinas and cause the collapse of Patriot resistance in the South. Now, this strategy was approved by Lord Germain in London, but neither informed Clinton of it. Now, Washington and Rochambeau had discussed their options. Washington wanted to attack the British in New York, and Rochambeau wanted to attack them in Virginia, where Cornwallis's forces were less established. Washington eventually gave way, and Lafayette took a combined Franco-American force into Virginia. Clinton misinterpreted his movements as preparations for an attack on New York, and he instructed Cornwallis to establish a fortified sea base where the Royal Navy could evacuate British troops to help defend New York. Now, when Lafayette entered Virginia, Cornwallis compiled with Clinton's orders and withdrew to Yorktown, where he constructed strong defenses and awaited execution. An agreement by the Spanish Navy to defend the French West Indies allowed Admiral Francois Joseph Paul de Grasse to relocate to the Atlantic seaboard, a move Arbuthnot did not anticipate. This provided Lafayette naval support, while the failure of previous combined operations at Newport and Savannah meant the coordination was planned more carefully. Despite repeated urging from his subordinates, Cornwallis made no attempt to engage Lafayette before he could establish siege lines. Expecting to be withdrawn within a few days, he also abandoned the outer defenses, which were promptly occupied by the besiegers, and it hastened British defeat. Now, on August 31st, a Royal Navy fleet under Thomas Graves left New York for Yorktown. After landing troops and munitions for the besiegers on August 30th, de Grasse remained in Chesapeake Bay, and he intercepted him on September 5th. Although the Battle of the Chesapeake was indecisive in terms of losses, Graves was forced to retreat, leaving Cornwallis isolated. Now, an attempted breakout over York River at Gloucester failed due to bad weather. Under heavy bombardment with dwindling supplies, on October 16, Cornwallis sent emissaries to General Washington to negotiate a surrender. After 12 hours of negotiations, the terms of surrender were finalized the following day. Now, responsibility for defeat was the subject of fierce public debate between Cornwallis, Clinton, and Germain. Clinton ultimately took most of the blame and spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity. Now, subsequent to Yorktown, American forces were assigned to supervise the armistice between Washington and Clinton, and it was made to facilitate British departure following the January 1782 law of Parliament forbidding any further British offensive action in North America. Now, British American The British-American negotiations in Paris led to signed preliminary agreements in November 1782, which acknowledged U.S. independence. They enacted Congressional War Objective, a British withdrawal from North America and cession of these regions to the U.S. was completed in stages in East Coast cities. Now, in the U.S. South, Generals Greene and Wayne observed observed the British removing excuse me observed the British removing their troops from Charleston on December 14th of 1782. Loyalist provincial militias of whites and free blacks and loyalists with slaves were transferred to Nova Scotia and the British West Indies. Native American allies of the British and some free blacks were left to escape unaided through the American lines. Now, on April 9th of 1783, Washington issued orders that all acts of hostility were to cease immediately, and that same day, by arrangement with Washington, Charleston issued a similar order to British troops. As directed by congressional resolution on May 26, 1783, all non-commissioned officers and enlisted were furloughed to their homes until the definitive treaty of peace, when they would be automatically discharged. The U.S. armies were directly disbanded in the field as of Washington's general orders on June 2nd of 1783. Once the Treaty of Paris was signed with Britain on September 3rd of 1783, Washington resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The last British occupation of New York City ended on November 25th of 1783 with the departure of Clinton's replacement, General Sir Guy Carleton. Now, to win their insurrection, Washington and the Continental Army needed to outlast the British will to fight. To restore British America, the British had to defeat the Continental Army quickly and compel the Second Continental Congress to retract its claim to self-governance. Historian Terry M. Mays of the Citadel identifies three separate types of warfare during the Revolutionary War. The first was colonial conflict, in which objections to imperial trade regulation were as significant as taxation policy. The second was a civil war between American patriots, American loyalists, and those who preferred to remain neutral. Particularly in the South, many battles were fought between patriots and loyalists with no British involvement, leading to divisions that continued after independence was achieved. The third element was a global war between France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, and Britain, with America serving as one of several different war theaters. Now, after entering the Revolutionary War in 1778, France provided the Americans money, weapons, soldiers, and naval assistance, while French troops fought under the U.S. command in North America. While Spain did not formally join the war in America, they provided access to the Mississippi River, and they captured British possessions on the Gulf of Mexico that denied bases for the Royal Navy, and they retook Minorca and besieged Gibraltar in Europe. Now, although the Dutch Republic was no longer a major power play prior to 1774, they still dominated the European carrying trade, and Dutch merchants made large profits by shipping French supplied munitions to the Patriots. This ended when Britain declared war in December 17, and the conflict proved disastrous to the Dutch economy. Now, the Second Continental Congress stood to benefit if the revolution evolved into a protracted war. Colonial state populations were largely prosperous, and they depended on local production for food and supplies, and rather than on imports from Britain. The 13 colonies were spread across most of the North American Atlantic seaboard, stretching over 1,000 miles. Now, most colonial farms were remote from the seaports, and control of 4 or 5 major ports did not give Britain control over American inland areas. Now, each state had established internal distribution systems, but motivation was also a major asset to this. Each colonial capital had its own newspapers and printers, and the Patriots enjoyed more popular support than the Loyalists ever did. But Britain hoped that the Loyalists would do much of the fighting, but found that the Loyalists did not engage as significantly as they had hoped for. When the Revolutionary War began, the Second Continental Congress lacked a professional army or navy. However, each of the colonies had a long-established system of local militia, which were combat tested and support the British regulars in the French and Indian War. Now, the colonial state legislators independently funded and controlled their local militias. Now, militiamen Okay, hold on here. Now here's a picture of George Washington, the first president. Right here. This is a picture of him from 1776. And this is housed at the Brooklyn Museum in Brooklyn, New York. And it was a portrait that was painted by Charles Willson Peale. Sometimes these old oh crap, that's not what I wanted. Go back. Okay, there we go. Okay. Now, militiamen were lightly armed, had very little training, and usually did not have any uniforms, so you could never tell who was who. Their units served for only a few weeks or months at a time, and they lacked the training and the discipline of more experienced soldiers. The local county militias were reluctant to travel far from home, and they were unavailable for extended operation periods. To compensate for this, the Continental Congress established a regular force known as the Continental Army on June 14, 1775, which proved to be the origin of the modern United States Army, and they appointed Washington as its commander-in-chief. However, it suffered significantly from the lack of an effective training program from largely inexperienced officers. Each state legislature appointed officers for both county and state militias, and the regimental Continental Line officers. Although Washington was required to accept congressional appointments, he was permitted to choose and command his own generals, such as Greene, his chief of artillery, Knox, and Alexander Hamilton, the chief of staff. One of Washington's most successful general officer recruits was Steuben, a veteran of the Prussian general staff who wrote the Revolutionary War Drill Manual. The development of the Continental Army was always a work in progress, and Washington used both his regulars and state militias throughout the whole war, and when properly employed, the combination allowed them to overwhelm small British forces, as they did in battles of Concord, Boston, Bennington, and Saratoga. Both sides used partisan warfare, but the state militias effectively suppressed loyalist activity when British regulars were not in the area. Now, Washington designed the overall military strategy in cooperation with Congress, established the principles of civilian supremacy in military affairs, personally recruited his senior officer corps, and kept the states focused on a common goal. Basically, it could be just one common goal or two common goals. But in this case, it would be one common goal. Washington initially employed the inexperienced officers and untrained troops in Fabian strategies, rather than risk frontal assaults against Britain's professional forces. Over the course of the war, Washington lost more battles than he won, but he never surrendered his troops and maintained a fighting force in the face of British field armies. Now, by prevailing the European standards, the armies in America were relatively small. They were limited by a lack of supplies and logistics, but the British were constrained by the logistical difficulty of transporting troops across the Atlantic and their dependence on local supplies. Washington never directly commanded more than 17,000 men, and the combined Franco-American army and the decisive American victory of Yorktown was only about 19,000 at the beginning of 1776. Patriot forces consisted of 20,000 men, with 2/3 in the Continental Army and the other third in the military states. About 250,000 American men served as regulars or as militia for the Revolutionary cause during the war, but there were never more than 90,000 men under his arms at any one given time. Hold on here. Now, on the whole, American officers never equaled their British opponents in tactics or any maneuvers, but they lost most of the pitched battles. The great success at Boston in 1776 and Saratoga in 1777 and Yorktown in 1781 were won by trapping the British far from base with a greater number of troops. After 1778, Washington's army was transformed into a more disciplined and effective force, mostly as a product of Baron von Steuben's military training. Immediately after the Continental Army emerged from Valley Forge in June of 1778, it proved its ability to match the military capabilities of the British at the Battle of Monmouth, including a Black Rhode Island regiment fending off a British bayonet attack and then countercharging the British for the first time as part of Washington's army. After the Battle of Monmouth, Washington came to realize that saving entire towns was not necessary, but preserving his army and keeping the revolutionary spirit alive was more important. Washington had informed Henry Lawrence, who was then president of the Second Continental Congress, that the possession of our towns, while we have an army in the field, will avail them very little. Now, although the Continental Congress was responsible for the war effort and provided supplies to the troops, Washington took it upon himself to pressure Congress and the state legislators to provide the essentials of war, but that was never nearly enough anyway to please them. Congress involved in its committee oversight and established the Board of War, which included members of the military, because the Board of War was also a committee that was ensnared with its own internal procedures. Congress also created the Postal Secretary of War, appointing Major General Benjamin Lincoln to the position in February 1781. Washington worked closely with Lincoln to coordinate civilian and military authorities, and he took charge of training and supplying the army. Now, during the first summer of the war, Washington began outfitting schooners and other small seagoing vessels to prey on ships supplying the British in Boston. The Second Continental Congress established the Continental Navy on October 13th of 1775, and they appointed Eskel Hopkins as its first commander. For most of the war, the Continental Navy included only a handful of small frigates and sloops, which were supported by privateers. On November 10th of 1775, Congress authorized the creation of the Continental Marines, which ultimately evolved into the United States Marine Corps. John Paul Jones became the first American naval hero when he captured HMS Drake on April 24th of 1778. The first victory for any American military vessel in British waters. The last victory was by the frigate USS Alliance that was commanded by Captain John Barry. On March 10th, 1783, the Alliance outgunned HMS Sybil in a 45-minute duel while escorting Spanish gold from Havana to the Congress in Philadelphia. After Yorktown, all U.S. Navy ships were sold or given away. It was the first time in American history that it had no fighting forces on the high sea. The Congress primarily commissioned privateers to reduce costs and to take advantage of the large proportion of colonial sailors found in British Europe and the British Empire. Now, in total, they included 1,700 ships, and that successfully captured 2,283 enemy ships to damage the British effort and to enrich themselves with the proceeds from the sale of cargo and the ship itself. About 55,000 sailors served aboard American privateers during the war. At the beginning of the war, the Americans had no major international allies, since most nation states had waited to see how the conflict would unfold. Over time, the Continental Army established its military credibility. Battles such as the Battle of Bennington, the Battle of Saratoga, and even defeats such as the Battle of Germantown proved decisive in gaining the support of powerful European nations, including France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. The Dutch moved from covertly supplying the Americans with weapons and supplies to overtly supporting them. The decisive American victory of Saratoga convinced France, which was already a longtime rival of Britain, to offer the Americans the Treaty of Amity and Commerce. The two nations also agreed to a defensive treaty of alliance to protect their trade, and also guaranteed American independence from Britain. To engage the United States as a French ally militarily, the treaty was conditioned on Britain initiating a war on France to stop it from trading with the U.S., and Spain and the Dutch Republic were invited to join by both France and the United States in the treaty, but neither was responsive to the request. Now, on June 13th of 1778, France declared war on Great Britain and invoked the French military alliance with the U.S., which ensured additional U.S. private support for French possessions in the Caribbean. Washington worked closely with the soldiers and navy that France would send to America, primarily through Lafayette, on his staff. French resistance made critical contributions required to defeat Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. Um, um, Now, the British military had considerable experience fighting in North America. However, in previous conflicts, they benefited from local logistics and support from the colonial militia in the American Revolutionary War. Reinforcements had to come from Europe, and maintaining large armies over such distances was extremely complex. Ships could take 3 months to cross the Atlantic, and orders from London were often outdated by the time that they had arrived. Um, Now, prior to the conflict, the colonies were largely anonymous economic and political entities with no centralized area of ultimate strategic importance. Um, Meant that unlike Europe, where the fall of capital city often ended in wars, that in America continued even after the loss of major settlements such as Philadelphia, the seat of Congress, New York, and Charleston. British power was reliant um, to the Royal Navy, whose dominance allowed them to resupply their own expeditionary forces while preventing access to enemy ports. However, the majority of the American population was agrarian rather than urban, supported by the French Navy and blockade runners based in the Dutch Caribbean. The economy was able to survive, but barely. Lord North, Prime Minister since 1770, delegated control of the war in North America to Lord George Germain, and the Earl of Sandwich was head of the Royal Navy from 1771 to 1782. And defeat at Saratoga in 1777 made it clear that the revolts would not be easily suppressed, especially after the Franco-American alliance of February in 1778, which Spain also accepted to join the conflict. The Royal Navy needed to prioritize either the war in America or the war in Europe. Germain advocated the former, and Sandwich the latter. Um, North initially backed the Southern strategy, attempting to exploit divisions between the Mercantile House North and the slave-owning South. But after the defeat of Yorktown, he was forced to accept that his policy had failed. Now, it was clear that the war was lost, although the Royal Navy forced the French to relocate their fleet to the Caribbean in November 1781, and he resumed a close blockade of American trade. Now, the resultant economic damage and rising inflation meant that the U.S. was now eager to end this war, while France was unable to provide any further loans. Congress could no longer pay the soldiers. The geographical size of the colonies and limited manpower meant that the British could not simultaneously conduct military operations and occupy any territory without local support. The debate persists over whether the defeat was inevitable, and one British statesman described it as like trying to conquer a map. While Furling argues Patriot victory was nothing short of a miracle, Ellis suggests that the odds always favored the Americans, especially after Hull squandered the chance of a decisive battle success in 1776. An opportunity that would never come again. The U.S. military history speculates the additional commitment of 10,000 fresh troops in 1780 would have placed British victory within the realm of a possibility. Now, the expulsion of France from North America in 1763 led to a drastic reduction in British troop levels in the colonies. In 1775, there were only 8,500 regular soldiers among a civilian population of 3 million people. The bulk of military resources in the Americas were focused on defending sugar islands in the Caribbean. Jamaica alone generated more revenue than all 13 American colonies combined. Now, with the end of the 7 Years' War, the permanent army in Britain was also cut back, which resulted in administrative difficulties when the war began a decade later. And here's a picture of Thomas Gage, who was a British Army commander from 1763 to 1775. Now, over the course of the war, there were 4 separate British commanders-in-chiefs. The first one was Thomas Gage, appointed in 1763, whose initial focus was establishing British rule in former French areas of Canada. Many in London blamed the revolts on his failure to take firm action earlier on, and he was relieved after the heavy losses that was incurred at the Battle of Bunker Hill. His replacement was Sir William Howe, a member of the Whig faction party in Parliament, who opposed the policy of coercion advocated by Lord North. Now, Cornwallis, who later surrendered at Yorktown, was one of many senior officers who initially refused to serve in North America. The 1775 campaign showed the British overestimated the capabilities of their own troops, and they underestimated the colonial militia. Requiring a reassessment of tactics and strategy and allowing the Patriots to take the initiative, Hull's responsibility is still debated despite receiving large numbers of reinforcements, and Bunker Hill seems to have permanently affected his self-confidence and lack of tactical flexibility, and that meant he often failed to follow up on opportunities. Many of his decisions were attributed to supply problems, such as his failure to pursue Washington's beaten army, and having lost the confidence of his subordinates, he was recalled after the Burgoyne surrendered at Saratoga. Um, Now, following the failure of the Carlisle Commission, British policy changed from treating the Patriots as subjects who needed to be reconciled to enemies who had to be defeated. In 1778, Hull was replaced by Sir William Henry Clinton. Sir Henry Clinton. Sorry. Regarded as an expert on tactics and strategy, like his predecessors, Clinton was handicapped by chronic supply issues. In addition, Clinton's strategy was compromised by conflict with political superiors in London and his colleagues in North America, especially Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot, replaced in early 1781 by Rodney, who was neither notified nor consulted when Germain approved Cornwallis's invasion of the South in 1781, and he delayed sending him reinforcements, believing the bulk of Washington's army was still outside New York City. After the surrender of Yorktown, Clinton was relieved by Carleton, whose major task was to oversee the evacuation of Loyalists and British troops from Savannah, Charleston, and New York City. Now, during the 18th century, states commonly hired foreign soldiers, including Britain, when it became clear additional troops were needed to suppress the revolt in America. It was decided to employ professional German soldiers, but there were several reasons for this, including public sympathy for the Patriot cause, historical reluctance to expand the British Army, and the time needed to recruit and train new people. Many smaller states in the Holy Roman Empire had a long tradition of renting their armies to the highest bidder. The most important was Hesse Cassel, which was known as the mercenary state. Now, the first supply agreements were signed by the North administration in late 1775. 30,000 Germans served in the American War, often generically referred to as Hessians. They included men from many other states, including Hanover and Brunswick. And Sir Henry Clinton recommended recruiting Russian troops, whom he had rated very highly, having seen them in action against the Ottomans. However, negotiations with Catherine the Great made little progress. Unlike previous wars, their use led to intense political debate in Britain. France and even Germany, where Frederick the Great refused to provide passage through his territories for troops hired for the American War. In March of 1776, the agreements were challenged in Parliament by Whigs who objected to coercion in general and the use of foreign soldiers to subdue British subjects. The debates were covered in detail by American newspapers in May of 1776. They received copies of the treaties themselves provided by British sympathizers, and they smuggled into North America and smuggled them into North America from London. Excuse me. Now, the prospect of foreign German soldiers being used in the colonies bolstered support for independence, and more so than taxation and other acts combined, the king was accused of declaring war on his own subjects, leading to the idea there were now two separate governments, by apparently showing Britain was determined to go to war, and it made hopes of reconciliation seem naive and hopeless, while the employment of that was regarded as foreign mercenaries that came under the charges leveled against George III in the Declaration of Independence. The Hessian reputation within Germany for brutality also increased support for the Patriot cause among German and American immigrants. The presence of over 150,000 German Americans meant both sides felt the German soldiers might be persuaded to desert, and one reason Clinton suggested employing Russians was that he felt they were less likely to defect. When the first German troops arrived on Staten Island in August of 1776, Congress approved the printing of handbills promising land and citizenship to any willing to join the Patriot cause. The British launched a counter-campaign claiming deserters could be executed. Desertion among the Germans occurred throughout the war, with the highest rate of desertion occurring between the surrender at Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris. German regiments were central to the British war effort. Of the estimated 30,000 sent to America, some 13,000 became casualties. Um, Now, wealthy loyalists convinced the British government that most of the colonists were sympathetic toward the crown. Consequently, British military planners relied on recruiting loyalists, but they had trouble recruiting sufficient numbers as the Patriots had widespread support throughout their area. Approximately 25,000 loyalists fought for the British throughout the war, although loyalists constituted about 20% of the colonial population, and they were concentrated in distinct communities. Many of them lived among the large plantation owners in the Tidewater region in South Carolina. Now, when the British began probing the back country in 1777 and 1778, they were faced with a real major problem. Any significant level of organized loyalist activity required a continued presence of British regulars. The available manpower that the British had in America was insufficient to protect loyalist territory and counter American offensives. The loyalist militias in the South were constantly defeated by neighboring Patriot militia, but the Patriot victory at the Battle of Kings Mountain irreversibly impaired loyalist militia capability in the South. Um, Now, when the war policy was administered by Howe, the crown's need to maintain loyalist support prevented it from using the traditional revolt suppression methods. Um, Now, the British cause suffered when their troops ransacked local homes during the aborted attack on Charleston in 1779 that enraged both Patriots and Loyalists after Congress rejected the Carlisle Peace Commission in 1778. That enraged both, that enraged both Patriots and Loyalists, and Westminster turned to hard war during Clinton's command. Neutral colonists in the Carolinas often allied with the Patriots. Commercially, Loyalists gained support when Patriots intimidated the suspected Tories by destroying property or tarring and feathering. Which I'm not sure what feathering is or tarring is. I gotta look that up. No, a loyalist militia unit, the British Legion, provided some of the best troops in British service, and it was commanded by Tarleton and gained a fearsome reputation in the colonies for brutally and needless slaughter. Now, women would play many various roles during the Revolutionary War, and they often accompanied their husbands whenever it was permitted. For example, throughout the war, throughout the war, Martha Washington was known to visit and provide aid to her husband, George Washington, at various American camps. Women often accompanied armies as well as camp followers to sell goods and perform necessary tasks in hospitals and camps, and they numbered in the thousands during the war. Now, women would also assume military roles. Some would dress up as men to directly support combat fights or act as spies on both sides. That was the same thing with Joan of Arc. I don't think I did a video on Joan of Arc. I gotta look. I might have. I don't remember. But Joan of Arc was one of the first ladies to fight in a war. Now, Anna Marie Lane joined her husband in the army. The Virginia General Assembly later cited her bravery, that she fought well dressed as a man and performed extraordinary military services and received a severe wound at the Battle of Germantown with the courage of a soldier. On April 26, 1777, Sybil Wellington is said to have written to alert militia forces to the British's approach that she has been called the female Paul Revere. Now, whether the riot occurred is questioned. A few others disguised themselves as men. General Sampson faltered until her gender was discovered, and she was discharged as a result, as Sally St. Clair was killed in action. Now, when the war began, the population of the 13 colonies included an estimated 500,000 slaves. Predominantly, they were used as labor on southern plantations. In November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation that promised freedom to any Patriot-owned slaves that were willing to take up arms. Although the announcement helped to fill a temporary manpower shortage, while the Loyalist prejudice meant recruits were eventually redirected to non-combatant roles, the Loyalists' motive was to deprive the Patriot planters of labor rather than to end slavery. Loyalist-owned slaves were returned. Um, Now, the 1779 Phillipsburg Proclamation that was issued by Clinton extended the offer of freedom to Patriot-owned slaves throughout the colonies. Now, it persuaded entire families to escape to British lines, many of which were employed growing food for the army by removing the requirement for military service. While Clinton organized the Black Pioneers, he also ensured fugitive slaves were returned to loyalist soldiers, loyalist owners with orders that they were not to be punished. As the war progressed, the service as regular soldiers and British units um, became increasingly common. Black loyalists formed two regiments of the Charleston garrison in 1783. Um, the estimates of the numbers who served the British during the war vary from 25,000 to 50,000, excluding those who escaped during the wartime. Thomas Jefferson estimated that Virginia may have lost 30,000 slaves due to them escaping. In South Carolina, nearly 25,000 slaves, about 30% of the enslaved population, either fled, they either migrated or they died, which significantly disputed the plantation economies both during and after the war. Now, black patriots were barred from the Continental Army until Washington convinced Congress in January 1778 that there was no further way to replace losses from disease and desertion. Now, the first Rhode Island Regiment formed in February, and it included former slaves whose owners were who were compensated. However, only 140 of its 225 soldiers were black, and recruitment stopped in June of 1788. Ultimately, okay. Now, ultimately, around 5,000 African Americans served in the Continental Army and Navy in a variety of roles, while another 4,000 were employed in Patriot militia units aboard the privateers or as teamsters, servants, and spies. After the war, a small minority received land grants or congressional pensions, and many others were returned to their masters post-war despite earlier promises of freedom. As a Patriot victory became increasingly likely, the treatment of black loyalists became a point of contention. After the surrender of Yorktown in 1781, Washington insisted all escapees be returned, but Cornwallis refused. In 1782 and in 1783, around 8,000 to 10,000 freed black slaves, blacks were evacuated by the British from Charleston, Savannah, and New York. Some moved into London, and while 3,000 to 4,000 settled in Nova Scotia, while Loyalists transferred 15,000 enslaved blacks to Jamaica and the Bahamas. The free black Loyalists who migrated to the British West Indies included regular soldiers from most Ethiopian regiments and those from Charleston who helped garrison the Leeward Islands. Now, a majority of the Native Americans east of the Mississippi River were affected by the war, and many tribes were divided over how to respond to this. A few tribes were friendly with the colonists, but most natives opposed the union of the colonies as a potential threat to their territory. Approximately 13,000 natives fought on the British side, with the largest group coming from the Iroquois tribes, who deployed around 1,500 men. Early in July of 1776, Cherokee allies of Britain attacked the short-lived Washington District of North Carolina, but their defeat splintered both Cherokee settlements and people, and was directly responsible to the rise of the Chickamauga Cherokee, who perpetuated the Cherokee-American Wars against American settlers for decades after the hostilities with Britain ended. The Muskogee and Seminole allies of Britain fought against Americans in Georgia and South Carolina in 1778. A force of 800 Muskogee destroyed American settlements along the Broad River in Georgia. Muskogee warriors who joined Thomas Brown's raids into South Carolina, and they assisted Britain during the siege of Savannah. Many Native Americans were involved in the fight between Britain and Spain on the Gulf Coast and along the British side of the Mississippi River. Thousands of Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw fought the major battles such as the Battle of Fort Charlotte, the Battle of Mobile, and the Siege of Pensacola. The Iroquois Confederacy was shattered as a result of the American Revolutionary War. The Seneca, the Onondaga, and the Cayuga tribes sided with the British, and the members of the Mohawk fought on both sides, and many Tuscarora and Oneida sided with the Americans. To retaliate against raids on American settlement by Loyalists and their Indian allies, the Continental Army dispatched a Sullivan expedition throughout the New York to debilitate the Iroquois tribes that had sided with the British. The Mohawk leaders, Joseph Lewis Cook and Joseph Branch, sided with the Americans and the British, respectively, which further exacerbated the split. Now, in the Western Theater, conflicts between settlers and Native Americans led to lingering distrust. In the 1783 Treaty of Paris, Great Britain had ceded control of the disputed lands between the Great Lakes and the Ohio River, but Native inhabitants were not a part of the peace. They were they were not part of the peace negotiations, and tribes in the Northwest Territory joined as the Western Confederacy. They allied with the British to resist American settlement, and their conflict continued with the Revolutionary War as the Northwest Indian War. The terms presented by the Carlisle Peace Commission in 1778 included acceptance of the principle of self-government. Parliament would recognize Congress as the governing body, suspended by any objectionable legislation, surrender its right to local colonial taxation, and discuss including American representatives in the House of Commons. In return, all property confiscated from Loyalists will be returned, British debts honored, and locally enforced martial law accepted. However, Congress demanded that either immediate recognition of independence or the withdrawal of all British troops. They knew the Commission were not authorized to accept these, bringing negotiations to a rapid end. Now, on February 27, 1782, a Whig motion to end the offensive war in America was carried by 19 votes. North resigned, obliging the King to invite Lord Rockingham to form a government. A consistent supporter of the Patriot cause, he made a commitment to U.S. independence. A condition of doing so, George III reluctantly accepted, and the new government took office on March 27th of 1782. However, Rockingham died unexpectedly on July 1st of that year, and was replaced by Lord Shelburne, who acknowledged American independence. When Lord Rockingham was elevated to Prime Minister, Congress consolidated its diplomatic consuls in Europe into a peace delegation at Paris. Now, the dean of the delegation was Benjamin Franklin. He had become a celebrity in the French court, but he was also influential in the courts of Prussia and Austria. Since the 1760s, Franklin had been an organizer of British-American inter-colony cooperation, and then he served as a colonial lobbyist to Parliament in London. John Adams had been consul to the Dutch Republic and was prominent early New England patriot. John Jay of the New York had been consul to Spain and was a past president of the Continental Congress as consul to the Dutch Republic. Henry Lawrence had secured a preliminary agreement for a trade agreement, although active in the preliminaries. He was not a signer of the conclusive. He was not a signer of the conclusive treaty. Now, the Whig negotiations included a long-term friend of Franklin, David Hartley, and Richard Oswald, who had negotiated Lawrence's release from the Tower of London. The preliminary peace treaty signed on November 30th met four key congressional demands: independence, territory up to the Mississippi, navigational rights to the Gulf of Mexico, and fishing rights in Newfoundland. Now, British strategy. Hold on here. Okay, British strategy was to strengthen the U.S. sufficiently to prevent France from regaining a foothold in North America, and they had little interest in these proposals. However, divisions between their opponents allowed them to negotiate separately within each to improve their overall position, starting with the American delegation in September of 1782. Now, the French and Spanish fought to improve their position by creating the U.S. dependent on them for support against Britain, thus reversing the losses of 1763. Both parties tried to negotiate a settlement with Britain, excluding the Americans. France proposed setting the western boundary of the U.S. along the Appalachians and matching and matching the British 1763 proclamation line. The Spanish suggested additional concessions in the vital Mississippi River Basin, but they required the cession of Georgia in violation of the Franco-American alliance. Um, now, now, facing difficulties to Spain over claims above the Mississippi River, and from France, was still reluctant to agree to American independence until all demands were met. Um, Now, John Jay told the British that he was willing to negotiate directly with them, cutting off France and Spain, and Prime Minister Lord Shelburne, in charge of the British negotiations, the British negotiations, agreed to it. Now, key agreements for the United States in obtaining peace included recognition of U.S. independence, all territory east of the Mississippi River, north of Florida and south of Canada, and fishing rights in the Grand Banks, and off the coast of Newfoundland and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The United States and Great Britain were each given perpetual access to the Mississippi River. Now, an Anglo-American preliminary peace was formally entered in November 1782, and Congress endorsed the settlement on April 15th of 1783. It announced that the achievement of peace with independence and the conclusive treaty was signed on September 2nd of 1783. In Paris, effectively the following year when Britain signed its treaty with France. John Adams, who became the second president, helped draft the treaty, claimed it represented one of the most important political events that ever happened on the globe, and it ratified respectively by Congress and Parliament. The final versions were exchanged in Paris the following spring. On November 25th, the last British troops remaining in the U.S. were evacuated from New York to Halifax. Now, and the aftermath of all this was the expanse of the territory that was now the U.S. included millions of sparsely settled acres south of the Great Lakes between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, and much of which was part of Canada. The tentative colonial migration became a flood during the war. Now Britain's extended post-war policy for the U.S. continued to try to establish an Indian burial state, Indian burial state below the Great Lakes as late as 1814. Now, during the War of 1812, the formerly acquired Western American lands continued to be populated by indigenous tribes that mostly been British allies. In practice, the British refused to abandon the forts on territory, and they formally transferred. Instead, they provisioned military allies for continuing frontier raids and sponsored the Northwest Indian War from 1785 to 1795. British sponsorship of local warfare on the U.S. continued until the Anglo-American Jay Treaty, authored by Hamilton, went into effect on February 29th of 1796. Now, of the European powers with American colonies adjacent to the newly created U.S., Spain was mostly threatened by American independence, and it was correspondingly the most hostile to it. Its territory adjacent to the U.S. was relatively undefended, so Spanish policies developed a combination of initiatives. Spanish soft power diplomatically challenged the British territorial cession west to the Mississippi River and the previous northern boundaries of Spanish Florida, and imposed a high tariff on American goods that blocked American settler access to the ports of New Orleans. At the same time, the Spanish also sponsored war within the U.S. by Indian proxies in its southwest territory ceded by France to Britain, and then Britain to the Americans. The total loss of life throughout the conflict is not relatively known, as it was typical in the wars of that era. Diseases such as smallpox claimed more lives than battle. Between 1775 and 1782, a smallpox epidemic throughout North America killed an estimated 130,000 people. But historian Joseph Ellis suggests that Washington having his troops inoculated against the disease was one of the most important decisions that was made. Now, more than 25,000 patriots died during active military service. Of these, approximately 6,800 were killed in battle, and at least 17,000 died from smallpox. The majority of the latter died while prisoners of war of the British, mostly in the prison ships in New York Harbor. Um, Now, the number of patriots seriously wounded or disabled by the war has been estimated to be between 8,500 to 25,000. Now, the French suffered 2,112 killed in combat in the United States, and the Spanish lost 124 killed and 247 wounded in West Florida. Um, British reports in 1781 puts their total army deaths at 6,046. In North America, between the years of 1775 to 1779, approximately 7,774 Germans died in British service, in addition to 4,888 deserters. Among those labeled German deserters, however, it is estimated that 1,800 were killed in battle. Um, Now, the American Revolution sets an example to overthrow both monarchy and colonial governments. Now, the United States has the world's oldest written constitution, which was used as a model in other countries, sometimes word for word, and the revolution inspired revolution in France, Haiti, American, and elsewhere. Although the revolution eliminated many forms of inequality and did little to change the status of women, despite the role they played in winning independence, most significantly it failed to end slavery, while many were uneasy over the contradiction of demanding liberty for some and yet denying it to others. The dependence of southern states on slave labor made abolition too great a challenge. Between 1774 and 1780, many of the states banned the importation of slaves, but the institution itself continued. Um, in 1782, Virginia passed a law permitting manumission, and over the next 8 years, more than 10,000 slaves were given their freedom. The number of abolitionist movements greatly increased, and by 1804, all the northern states had outlawed it. However, slavery continued to be a serious social and political issue and caused divisions that would have ultimately ended the Civil War. Now, Now, the body of historical writings in the American Revolution cites many motivations for the Patriot Revolt. American patriots stressed the denial of their constitutional rights as Englishmen, especially no taxation without representation, which was a common thing that was stated along that time. Contemporaries credit the American Enlightenment with laying the intellectual, moral, and ethical foundations for the American Revolution among the founding fathers who were influenced by the classical liberalism of John Locke and other Enlightenment writers and philosophers. Two treaties of government has long been cited as a major influence on the Revolutionary era American thinking, but historian David Lundberg and Henry F. May contended that Locke's essay concerning human understanding was far more widely known. Historians since the 1960s has empathized that the Patriot Constitutional argument was made possible by the emergence of an American nationalism that united the 13 colonies. In turn, that nationalism was rooted in the Republic value system that demanded consent of the governed and deeply opposed aristocratic control. Now, in Britain, on the other hand, republicanism was largely a fringe ideology since it challenged the aristocratic control of the British monarchy and political system. Political power was not controlled by an aristocracy or nobility of the 13 colonies. Instead, the colonial political system was based on the winners of free elections, which were open at the time to the majority of white men. In an analysis of the revolution, historians in recent decades have often cited three motivations behind it. The Atlantic history view places that the American story in a broader context, including subsequent revolutions in France and Haiti, intends to reintegrate the historiographies of the American Revolution of the British Empire. The new social history approach looks at community social structure to find cleavages that were magnified into colonial cleavages. Um, Now, the ideological approach that centers on republicanism in the United States, republicanism dictated there would be no royalty, aristocracy, or national church, but a love for continuation of the British common law, which American lawyers and jurists understood and approved, and they used in their everyday practice. Historians have examined how the rising American legal profession adopted British common law to incorporate republicanism by selective revision of the legal customs and by introducing more choices or from the courts. Um, Now, after the first U.S. postage stamp was issued in 1849, the U.S. Postal Service frequently issued commemorative stamps celebrating people and events of the Revolutionary War, and the first such stamp was the Liberty Bell issue of 1926. So that is the end of the American Revolution part. Um, Now this I got the other day. My Cup of a Wolf. I love this thing. Especially I love wolves. Wolves. The wolves are my favorite animal. I'm speaking of that. I'm gonna go see the new Leonardo DiCaprio movie. That's what I'm gonna go see tonight. Now that's the end of the American Revolutionary of the American Revolutionary War. Now let me know what history of events interest you, and I'll try to get to the video and try to get a video put out next week. Next week hopefully on it. We're gonna go back up here, and there's been so many. Now this reminds me of something that George Carlin had said, because I remember George Carlin made jokes about war, and he made jokes about a VCR. And he said, and he made jokes about, and George Carlin said this: did you happen to notice that the bullets, the guns, and bombs are all shaped like dicks? And he's like, we can't make a VCR worth a fuck, but we can bomb the fuck out of your country. And he's like we're good at war, but we're not good at anything else. God, I miss George Carlin. Yeah, but my Cubs won yesterday. They beat St. Louis yesterday, 12-1. There's only like 2 games left today and tomorrow before the playoffs start for baseball, and then basketball will be starting. And basically, I'm a Bulls fan, but I can guarantee you right now, the Bulls are not going to be shit this year, because they don't really have nobody as long as Billy Donovan's coach. Oh, that's not what I need. Go back. So you guys can let me know what videos you want me to do for next week. I'll give you a list, and you tell me which one I should do. Let's go here. The one about Santa Claus I'm going to save until December, because it's more of a Christmas time. We have World War I, World War II, Al Capone, the extraterrestrials in fiction, slavery, England, Ireland, Scotland, Irish mythology, piracy, golden age of piracy, and those are the ones I got for possibly next week, along with research and other history stuff that's been going on throughout the years. Just let me know what you guys think. But if you like this video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King. If you want me to keep doing history videos, I'll keep doing them, and try to switch up a little bit too every now and then with everything else. And thanks for tuning in, and I hope you guys enjoyed.